Guys, please do subscribe our channel and support us. Donald Trump may have just turned America's closest ally into the Republican Party's biggest political nightmare. And the panic inside GOP circles is becoming impossible to hide. What started as aggressive rhetoric against Canada, threats, tariffs, insults, even bizarre comments about annexation, is now creating a political backlash so powerful that some Republican strategists fear it could cost them control of Congress. Not years from now, next election. And the reason is simple. This fight is no longer happening on television. It's happening in real towns, on real streets, inside real businesses where Americans are already feeling the consequences. Because when politicians start economic wars with neighboring countries, the first people hurt are usually the people living closest to the border. And right now, across America's northern states, that pain is spreading fast. The average American probably doesn't spend much time thinking about the US-Canada relationship. It feels permanent, stable, almost automatic. But what most people don't realize is that the American and Canadian economies are deeply connected in ways that affect millions of jobs every single day. Factories, tourism, agriculture, energy, retail, transportation. Entire communities survive because goods and people move freely across that border. And now many of those communities are starting to suffer. The political warning signs first exploded in Michigan. And honestly, there may be no better example of how dangerous this situation is becoming for Republicans. Michigan and Ontario operate almost like one giant economic region. Businesses on both sides depend on each other constantly. Auto manufacturing alone sends billions of dollars back and forth every year. A single car part might cross the border multiple times before a vehicle is finished. Canadian families regularly travel into Michigan for shopping, entertainment, restaurants, and tourism. American companies depend on Canadian customers far more than many people realize. But once tensions between Trump and Canada escalated, something changed. Canadians started staying home. Border traffic began falling sharply. Businesses noticed immediately. Restaurant owners, hotel managers, retail stores, duty-free shops, small towns that depended on cross-border tourism suddenly saw fewer cars, fewer customers, and fewer dollars flowing into their local economies. And that economic pain is now becoming political pain for Republicans. Because voters don't experience trade wars as abstract political debates. They experience them through empty storefronts, reduced business, layoffs, and shrinking paychecks. That's why Democratic strategists believe they may have found one of the strongest campaign issues heading into the next election cycle. Their message is brutally simple. Republicans supported policies that hurt local economies. And in politics, simple messages are often the most dangerous ones. Imagine being a small business owner in a Michigan border town. For years, Canadian visitors helped keep your business alive. Weekends were busy. Tourism dollars flowed steadily. Then suddenly, political tensions explode. Customers stop coming. Sales drop. Expenses remain high. And politicians in Washington continue escalating the conflict anyway. That frustration becomes very personal very quickly. And Democrats are making sure voters connect that frustration directly to Republican leadership. What makes this especially dangerous for the GOP is that many of these districts are already politically competitive. A few thousand votes can decide elections. Sometimes only hundreds. That means even relatively small economic shifts can completely change political outcomes. And border economies are now shifting dramatically. The situation has become so serious that even some Republican officials are quietly distancing themselves from the most aggressive anti-Canada rhetoric. Because unlike cable news arguments, economic damage is measurable. People can literally see it happening. Empty parking lots, declining tourism, fewer deliveries, slower business activity. It's difficult to argue the economy is thriving when voters can physically watch it slowing down around them. One of the biggest symbols of this growing crisis is the Gordie Howe International Bridge project between Detroit and Windsor. This bridge was supposed to represent the future of North American trade cooperation, a massive infrastructure investment connecting two economies even more closely together. Instead, it has become politically controversial, and for many Michigan voters, attacks on the project feel like attacks on their own future economic survival. That's the key mistake many political leaders make when talking about trade. They think voters only care about patriotic slogans, but voters also care about stability. jobs, predictable business conditions, economic security. And once those things start disappearing, political loyalty becomes much weaker. Now zoom out beyond Michigan, and the pattern becomes even more alarming for Republicans. In New York, businesses near the border report major declines in Canadian visitors. In Vermont, some duty-free stores are struggling to survive. In Washington state, tourism officials are warning about serious economic consequences if tensions continue escalating. In North Dakota and Montana, agricultural industries worry about retaliation hurting exports. And suddenly this stops looking like one isolated regional issue. It starts looking like a broader economic backlash spreading across multiple states at the exact moment Republicans are preparing for critical elections. That timing could not be worse for the GOP, because elections are emotional, and economic anxiety creates emotional voters, especially when people believe the damage was avoidable. What makes this entire situation even more fascinating is the cultural shift happening underneath it. For years, confrontational politics dominated headlines. Many politicians discovered they could energize supporters through conflict, anger, and nationalist rhetoric. And for a long time, that strategy worked surprisingly well. But now some analysts believe voters may finally be reaching a limit. Because there's a difference between aggressive rhetoric sounding exciting on television and aggressive rhetoric hurting your local economy in real life. Once consequences become personal, politics changes. That's exactly what may be happening now. Canadians themselves have already shown signs of this shift politically. Mark Carney built much of his political momentum around standing firmly against American pressure and defending Canadian sovereignty. And many Canadian voters rewarded that approach. Now Democrats inside the United States are trying to mirror a similar strategy in border regions, presenting themselves as defenders of economic stability against reckless political confrontation. And honestly, the strategy makes sense, because most voters are not ideological trade experts. They simply want functioning economies, stable prices, safe jobs, predictable leadership. When politics begins threatening those things, frustration grows rapidly. Even some Republican donors and business groups are reportedly becoming nervous behind closed doors. Many industries that traditionally lean conservative, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, retail, rely heavily on strong relationships with Canada. These businesses don't want permanent economic warfare with America's largest trading partner. They want stability, and stability becomes harder to maintain when political rhetoric constantly escalates. Now, to be fair, many Trump supporters still strongly back his confrontational style. They see aggressive trade tactics as necessary leverage. They believe America has been taken advantage of economically for years, and that tougher leadership is long overdue. That argument still resonates with millions of voters. But the political risk emerges when economic pain begins outweighing emotional enthusiasm. Because at the end of the day, voters eventually judge results. Not slogans, not speeches, results. And right now, Republicans in several key regions fear they may be trapped defending policies producing visible economic damage. That's an extremely dangerous position heading into elections, especially when opponents can point directly at struggling businesses as evidence. What's remarkable is how self-inflicted much of this crisis appears. Nobody forced this conflict to escalate to this level. Nobody required attacks against Canada to become such a major political obsession. Yet here we are. And now Republican candidates across multiple states may pay the political price for decisions they didn't personally make and cannot fully control. That's the brutal reality of modern party politics. When a national leader dominates the political brand, every local candidate becomes connected to the consequences, good or bad. And increasingly, some Republicans fear the consequences are turning very bad. If Democrats successfully frame the next election as a choice between economic stability and endless political confrontation, the entire political map could shift dramatically. Because swing voters often decide elections based less on ideology and more on whether life feels stable or chaotic. Right now, many Americans feel exhausted by constant conflict, economic uncertainty, political division, inflation, global instability. And if voters begin associating Republicans with more chaos instead of more security, the electoral consequences could become severe. That's why strategists in both parties are watching the northern border so carefully right now. Because what's happening there may become a preview of something much larger happening across American politics itself. A growing question voters are starting to ask. At what point does confrontation stop looking strong and start looking reckless? And depending on how the next several months unfold, that question could end up reshaping Congress, border economies, and even the future direction of American politics itself. Because sometimes political movements don't collapse because opponents defeat them. Sometimes they collapse because voters simply grow tired of living inside the chaos. And right now, that fatigue is becoming impossible to ignore.